The immaculately dressed elven secretary led Arthur through quiet corridors until they arrived at the council chamber. Their short walk carried the weight of unspoken tension, broken only by the subtle rustle of parchment in Mariel's hands. Inside, Mariel finally shifted her gaze from the documents she had been reviewing. She explained that she had already examined multiple accounts of the recent battle, including Aya's, but insisted that it was best to hear Arthur's version directly. Arthur began recounting everything he knew of the confrontation, though he carefully withheld the truth that it was the Scythe Ceres who had ultimately defeated Uto. The council interrupted at intervals, pressing for clarification or details whenever gaps appeared, and their probing soon revealed lingering doubts about his story. King Blaine's expression hardened with suspicion as he questioned Arthur's feats. He openly wondered how someone who had not yet reached the White Core stage could possibly defeat not one, but two retainers, especially when seasoned lances had already fallen before the war had truly begun. Virian's eyes narrowed as he defended Arthur, reminding the council that Arthur held the title of Lance, and such an honor was not given lightly. Blaine, however, persisted. His tone carried less accusation and more cold practicality as he pressed for an explanation. To him, Arthur's victories were more than remarkable. They were lessons that could be used to prepare the remaining lances for future battles against retainers and scythes. Arthur responded with calm composure, clarifying that the first retainer he faced had not been as formidable as Uto, the one now held captive. Even then, the battle had left its mark, costing him an Ashura-forged sword and scarring his body. A heavy silence filled the chamber as Arthur removed the glove from his left hand and pulled down the collar of his tunic, revealing the scars etched into his flesh. Gasps of surprise rippled across the council members' faces, their disbelief plain, everyone except Virian. Arthur pressed on, explaining that Uto could have ended both his and Sylvie's lives instantly, yet chose not to. The retainer's only drive had been the thrill of battle. When Arthur failed to provide the challenge Uto craved, the enemy deliberately lowered his guard, goading him with taunts in hopes of provoking a reckless response. It was in that fleeting carelessness that Arthur and Sylvie seized their chance, striking with precision and shattering Uto's horns. Baron leaned forward, suspicion sharp in his eyes. He questioned how Arthur had known that destroying Avritra's horns would affect its combat ability. Arthur admitted that he had not known. Even the Asuras themselves seemed ignorant of such a weakness, otherwise they would have revealed it long ago. His choice had been little more than instinct, guided by a memory of the late Lance, Alea, who once spoke of how Uto's fury erupted when she had merely chipped away a fragment of his horn. It was a fragile explanation, half-truth at best, yet invoking Alea's name seemed to ease the scrutiny. Still unconvinced, Baron pressed on, ready to voice his disbelief, but Vare's cold authority cut him short. She urged Arthur to continue without interruption. Arthur then recounted how Uto's strength had diminished drastically after the destruction of his horns. In that weakened state, he and Sylvie barely managed to overpower the retainer. His memory blurred after that, until the moment Aya aroused him back to consciousness. Sylvie had been lying beside him, gravely wounded, and though her body was safe, she remained hospitalized, unmoving, silent, and showing no sign of waking. Virian's voice carried the weight of finality as he acknowledged Arthur's testimony, noting that his account would be preserved. Without delay, he turned the council's focus to the next matter of business. Priscilla shifted the discussion toward the alliance with the dwarves, her calm tone in stark contrast to the heavy silence that had followed Arthur's words. Blaine, however, slammed his fist against the table, his frustration erupting in force. He reminded the council that they were meant to address the matter of traitors, yet the Ashura ambassador, whose guidance they needed most, was conspicuously absent. Priscilla outlined the precarious situation with measured urgency. Rhadeas lay imprisoned, and Lord Alder was absent, leaving the dwarves without a clear leader. Drawing on Arthur's reconnaissance in Darv, she warned that multiple factions were covertly aiding the Alacrian army, and the dwarves' allegiance hung by a thread. Alduin proposed a straightforward military solution: deploy forces from Sapin into Darv to oversee the dwarven hold. Only for Blaine to reject it outright, he warned that a human military presence would only deepen the dwarves' fear and resentments, making force control counterproductive. Arthur felt an idea ignite within him, but the council's heavy silence and the uncertain bounds of his authority held him back. He risked speaking anyway, steering the room with a question about whether Rhadeas' capture had been publicized. Blaine's raised brow answered before words could: the capture had been kept secret. Seizing that opening, Arthur proposed turning the secrecy into a weapon. If Rhadeas' capture remained unknown, their messages could be routed through him, orders appearing to come from the dwarf leader rather than the human council, allowing the council to manipulate communications and buy time to secure vital intelligence. The room brightened with sudden momentum. Virian's expression shifted from skepticism to admiration. He privately acknowledged the cunning of the plan and joked at the thought of facing Arthur in actual warfare. Alduin focused on the tactical detail of extracting the method through which Rhadeas had been communicating with hostile factions, while Blaine quickly saw how to exploit the ruse by issuing orders under Rhadeas' name. Mariel cautioned that the operation would not immediately loosen the Alacrian's grip, but she agreed it could still secure crucial information. Virian then orchestrated the plan plan's assignments with decisive clarity that he would conduct General Mika's questioning, and General Aya would handle the Vritra threat, but Radeus's interrogation would take precedence to lock down the dwarves' loyalty. The council moved in unison, heads bowed and hands lifted in agreement, the collective nods sealing the strategy. As the discussion wound down, Varian shifted tone from strategy to recognition. He observed that wartime necessity often forced them to overlook deeds large and small, yet Arthur's feat, slaying not one but 2 retainers and uprooting a dangerous traitor, demanded acknowledgement. Such actions merited some form of reward. Aya bowed with quiet dignity, her voice steady as she declined recognition. She explained that her actions had not been for personal gain, but for the sake of winning the war. Varian's gaze shifted toward Arthur. The question lingered in the air. What reward would he ask for? Arthur's thoughts turned inward, back to lessons from his past life. He knew well that in moments like these, it was often wiser to refuse rewards altogether. Yet the weight of his recent battles and the precarious state of his strength pressed against his judgment. He decided to speak. The council's rulers, 2 kings and 2 queens, regarded him with surprise when he admitted there was something he desired. Varian, however, simply prompted him to continue, curiosity plain in his expression. Arthur declared his request. He wished to be withdrawn from the battlefield. The words stunned Varian, if only for a moment. It was no small request in the midst of war, especially after the loss of 1 lance, and possibly another. But Arthur pressed on. He clarified that it was not permanent, only for a few months. The war was accelerating with alarming speed, and though he was the newest and youngest among the lances, he had already come face to face with death twice. He feared that his next survival might hinge on luck or an enemy's mistake rather than his own strength. What he needed now was training, time to sharpen himself before war stripped him of the chance. Varian's stern features softened as he placed a hand firmly on Arthur's shoulder. He granted 2 months at most, warning that even then there was no guarantee Arthur would not be summoned if the war demanded it. He also made clear that Arthur's presence would still be required in council meetings. Alduin interjected, questioning how Arthur intended to conduct meaningful training within the confines of the castle. Arthur revealed the second part of his request. To accelerate his progress, he sought the assistance of 4 highly skilled conjurers, each possessing mastery over a different elemental affinity. With the council meeting concluded, Arthur made his way toward Ellie's room so they could visit Sylvie together. For the first time in days, his steps felt lighter, his heart carrying a rare trace of ease. The corridors of the castle were silent and empty, granting him an uninterrupted walk, during which he considered how he might greet his younger sister. At her door, he rapped gently, and with mischievous intent masked his voice in a shrill, airy tone, as if to play the part of a ghost. The silence that followed was broken by Ellie's dry mutter from within, commanding Boo to attack. The massive bear burst from the room, charging straight at him. Arthur had only a heartbeat to recognize his mistake before 700 pounds of muscle and fur slammed against him. The impact left him pinned beneath the beast, and he quickly realized that Ellie's sense of humor bore far more resemblance to their mother's sharp wit than he had expected. Ellie stood in the doorway with a scowl, unimpressed by his theatrics. She reminded him with blunt words that she was no longer a child who would be frightened by ghostly games. Arthur acknowledged her jab with quiet acceptance, conceding that he had indeed earned the bear's ambush, yet her sternness did not last. Ellie's expression softened, and she stepped forward to wrap her small arms around him. For the first time since returning to the castle, he felt the tight coil of tension within him begin to loosen. In her embrace, he allowed himself the comfort of homecoming. A streak of light shot through the trees, bending slightly as it traveled before striking its target with precision, a wooden post no larger than Arthur's head. He applauded the effort, his sister responding with a graceful curtsy and a triumphant grin. Pride radiated from her expression as she stood balanced atop Boo, the enormous bear sprawled lazily on his back beneath her. Arthur asked whether she could maintain such accuracy while Boo was moving. Ellie's shoulders sagged, and she admitted her struggle. Helen had made it appear effortless, yet Ellie had not been able to land a single shot in motion. She complained that Boo's clumsy gait made the task worse, as if the beast deliberately tried to throw her off balance. Arthur stifled a laugh, though Boo himself gave a deep, grumbling sound of protest at the accusation. Curious, Arthur asked how much time she spent training each day. Ellie tilted her head, thinking, and explained that she never truly kept track, only that the sun often set while she was still practicing. By her estimate, she spent 6 or 7 hours honing her skill. His brow furrowed at her answer, and he pressed further, questioning whether she dedicated time to studying or to her friends. A nervous chuckle escaped her lips as she explained that classes at the castle were only held once a week and she could finish her assignments in a single day. As for friends, she claimed with mock seriousness that she was quite popular. Arthur arched a brow at her, his silence pressing for honesty. Under the weight of his gaze, Ellie finally burst out in frustration, confessing that she had little interest in the endless chatter of her peers. She could not understand how anyone could spend hours speaking only of boys and clothes. He suggested, half teasing, that surely there were children her age who shared an interest in magic. Ellie admitted that that there had been a few. Arthur gestured for her to sit beside him, and she lowered herself to the ground at his side before continuing. Those few friends, she explained, had either been taken by their parents away from the castle or sent to magic academies after awakening their cores. Arthur's thoughts darkened for a moment. His sister had been fortunate to train under the mages of the castle, a privilege most children lacked. Yet he could not fault those parents who sought to secure proper guidance for their children, especially when the looming shadow of war threatened to reach even the safest halls. He asked Ellie if she too wished to attend a magic academy. Without hesitation, she confessed that she did, though she knew their parents, and Arthur himself, would only worry. Her words carried a maturity far beyond her years. At 12, she spoke with the weight of someone who had already accepted responsibilities too heavy for her small frame. Arthur's chest tightened with a quiet ache. He knew too well the burden of growing up too quickly, and part of him longed selfishly for her to remain the innocent girl who once grew nervous at her own birthday celebration. Resolving himself, Arthur told her that when the opportunity came, he would speak with their parents about sending her to school. Ellie froze in disbelief, her wide eyes silently asking if he truly meant it. He tempered her hope with caution, adding that a guard would accompany her for safety. Though he acknowledged it might feel suffocating to always have someone by her side, he promised to find someone she would be comfortable with. Before he could finish, Ellie threw herself against him, her arms locking around him in a fierce embrace. Arthur returned the embrace gently, warning her not to let her hopes rise too high. Her laughter broke through the moment, bright and defiant. She declared it was already too late, then pulled away to retrieve her bow. Determination shone on her face as she announced that she would practice harder than ever, hard enough to surpass even the arrogant nobles she dreamed of outshining. Leaving Ellie to her training, Arthur returned to his chambers with a quiet sense of peace. The past few days spent with her had been a welcome reprieve. With Tessia away on another mission and Sylvie still recovering, the castle had felt unusually subdued. That calm shattered when a door suddenly slammed open, startling him. Gideon stormed into the corridor, his voice echoing with frustration as he shouted that he was an artificer, not an economist. His wild gaze landed on Arthur, and without hesitation he rushed forward, grasping the young Lance's cheeks with dramatic urgency. With theatrical flair, he demanded the use of Arthur's God-sent brain, as if salvation rested in it. Arthur could only think with weary humor that he was neither an artificer nor an economist. Yet, as always with Gideon, resistance seemed futile. The two soon found themselves walking side by side toward the training grounds, the eccentric inventor speaking in bursts of exasperation. Arthur pieced together the issue. Attacks had increased along the stretch between Blackbend and the wall, and the council was pressuring Gideon to bolster protection for caravans and mages. Gideon admitted the demand was simple in words, but impossible in practice. Resources were stretched thin, and there was no way to safeguard every convoy and every spellcaster traversing the city routes. Arthur's thoughts sharpened with suspicion. Something in Blackbend must have been drawing these targeted strikes. Gideon clarified without pause. The city was not only supplying rations, but also manufacturing weapons for their soldiers. Its role was critical, ensuring the steady flow of provisions and arms to the wall. Arthur understood at once. The wall remained the front line against both the Alacrian army and the roaming beasts that threatened Dicathen. Its stability and the continuous lifeline of supplies from Blackbend was not just important, but vital for survival in the war. Arthur's mind turned to the terrain surrounding Blackbend. He recalled that the land was mostly open farmland or clear mountainside, leaving little cover for carriages carrying supplies. Their visibility made them easy targets. Rather than focusing only on protection, he considered that perhaps the solution lay in optimizing the supply routes themselves. Gideon perked up immediately, curiosity flashing in his eyes. He demanded to know what idea was brewing in Arthur's mind. Arthur responded by asking about the state of the mines that supplied fuel for their ships. Gideon launched into explanation with his usual enthusiasm. He clarified that 5 major sites were still being excavated, producing a mineral he had named combustium. Arthur frowned at the unfamiliar term, prompting Gideon to explain further. The mineral, discovered when Arthur had once described coal to him, was capable of producing extraordinary energy. Just 10 pounds could power a ship for a dozen miles at full speed. His eyes gleamed as he praised its unmatched potential. Arthur considered the implications carefully and admitted that he might have an idea worth developing. Gideon leaned closer, eager for details, certain that combustium was at the center of Arthur's plan. But Arthur withheld the explanation for now, promising only that he needed more time to think. Before Gideon could press further, a voice called out from behind. Arthur turned to see a middle-aged elf approaching with graceful composure. She introduced herself as Alanis Amaria, newly assigned by Commander Virion to serve as Arthur's attendant. Gideon's eyes widened at her presence, his face flushing as he struggled to compose himself. Arthur caught the reaction instantly and shifted his gaze toward him, but Gideon quickly coughed into his hand, turning away in an unconvincing attempt to hide his embarrassment. Alanis, seemingly unfazed, acknowledged Gideon with polite warmth. She praised him for his reputation as the esteemed artificer whose contributions had been spoken of even beyond the council. Gideon flushed deeper and dismissed the compliment with false modesty, claiming it was nothing more than a simple discussion with with the king about securing supply routes to the wall. Arthur inwardly stiffened at the words. That conversation was meant to remain confidential, yet Gideon had casually spoken of it within moments of meeting her. Alanis inclined her head respectfully before explaining that she had been assigned to escort Arthur to the training grounds, where his request had already been prepared. Arthur followed, uncertain of what exactly awaited him. He had expected a few skilled sparring partners, but the sight that greeted him made him pause. On the ground stood not only 3 elders, each radiating the weight of their power, but also Princess Catelyn herself. Varian welcomed him with his usual commanding presence, introducing the group. Arthur already knew Princess Catelyn of the royal Glader family, but now he was formally introduced to her guardian, Hester Flamesworth. The name caught him off guard, drawing recognition immediately. Hester, with a quiet pride in her voice, acknowledged his familiarity with her family. Arthur offered polite words of greeting, remarking with genuine warmth that it was a pleasant surprise to see Catelyn again so soon. Curiosity, however, pressed him to ask what had brought her here. Catelyn's cheeks colored faintly as she lowered her gaze, admitting in a soft voice that she was here to train with him. Arthur quickly corrected himself, apologizing for not realizing sooner what should have been obvious. As he studied her, he noted how far she had come since their time in Xyrus. Her aura had grown sharper and stronger, no longer carrying the fragility of someone in need of constant protection. Hester's voice carried steady authority as she explained further. Catelyn was an accomplished ice affinity conjurer, now standing firmly in the dark yellow core stage. At Varian's request, Hester herself had been tasked with supporting Arthur's training, though her primary duty remained the princess's safety. By training alongside Arthur, she explained, both goals could be achieved without conflict. Catelyn added that she would occasionally have to leave for instruction under Master Vare, but aside from that, she expressed her eagerness to help Arthur with his training. A gruff voice rumbled from atop a raised stone pillar, remarking on the sight of a princess and her knight as a classic pair. Arthur turned to see a broad-shouldered dwarf studying him with sharp eyes. The dwarf leapt down and extended a hand with a grip as unyielding as stone itself, introducing himself as Bondamog Lonwyd, though most called him Bond. Arthur matched the handshake with equal firmness, drawing a nod of approval. Bond released his hand with a satisfied grunt, noting his strength. Varian chuckled lightly, warning the dwarf to be careful. Arthur had not become a lance through appearance alone. He then introduced Bond as both a longtime friend and a genius in earth affinity magic, despite his rough demeanor. Bond bristled at the casual remarks, snapping that he was considered quite the ladies' man back home. Varian brushed him off with dismissive humor, telling him not to be so sensitive. Arthur watched the two exchange barbs, and though the banter appeared genuine, he could not help but feel cautious. The dwarf was someone he had never seen before, and given the council's delicate state, Varian's introduction as a friend seemed carefully chosen to put him at ease. The realization unsettled him. A part of him wondered if his suspicion stemmed less from reason and more from his own prejudice, a thought that troubled him deeply. Varian moved the introductions along, turning to a tall elf with a stark presence. He began to announce his name and role, but the man interrupted curtly, stating that Arthur only needed to know his name, Camus Celeridon. Anything else was irrelevant. Arthur noted the boldness it took to cut Varian short. The act suggested either remarkable bravery, deep familiarity, or both. His disheveled appearance and lack of care for hygiene were unusual among elves, making him stand out even further. Varian clapped his hands together, bringing the gathering to a close. He declared that over the coming weeks, they would all grow well acquainted, though his own time would be consumed by mountains of paperwork. Hosting duties would fall to Miss Watskin and Miss Maria. Emily arrived just then, carrying a box. Clearing her throat, she announced there were details to cover before Arthur's training could begin. Reaching into the box, she pulled out what appeared to be pieces of leather armor, though they were connected by thin wires similar to those that lined the training hall's walls. Arthur soon found himself being dressed in the contraption, its strange design leaving him feeling more than a little ridiculous. Arthur shifted uneasily in the strange leather and wire getup, muttering in frustration about how many times he would have to play dress up. Emily beamed with satisfaction, declaring the fit perfect before turning him toward Alanis for the next step. Alanis approached with calm professionalism, gently taking his hand. She asked him to remain still, and as she closed her fingers around his, a soft green glow spread from her palms. Her expression remained steady as she scribbled into a small notebook, confirming that the scans were complete. Arthur barely had time to ask what she meant before Emily lifted the packaged box onto the table, her energy bubbling as she launched into explanation. She pointed out the specialized equipment that lined the training grounds, each piece designed with care to aid in his progression. She praised his mastery of mana manipulation in most areas, but then her words turned sharp, cutting into him with painful precision. Arthur froze as Emily stated outright that he had plateaued in elemental magic. According to her assessment, he had made no progress at all, lagging behind every other lance. Her tone, blunt and clinical, went so far as to say he might as well be nothing more than a dual elemental mage. Heat crept across Arthur's face as he tried to interrupt, his embarrassment plain. He urged her to stop, assuring her that the others had already grasped the point. Catelyn, however, tilted her head with quiet surprise. abilities. She reminded him that he had trained under the Ashuras. Arthur admitted that most of that time had been spent refining close combat augmentation rather than honing elemental control. Emily's judgment, he conceded, was fair. He had relied far too heavily on ice and lightning, and now, by training with them, he hoped to broaden his mastery of the other elements. Bond rubbed his chin thoughtfully, confessing that even thinking about handling more than one affinity gave him a headache. The notion of 4 elements, plus the complexity of Arthur's 2 deviant affinities, was enough to make him wince. Hester chuckled lightly, countering that Arthur's mental capacity was not nearly as limited as Bond's. She voiced confidence that he would manage. The dwarf bristled at once, snapping back in indignation. He refused to accept the jab, insisting loudly that his mental capacity was fully unrestricted. Emily intervened before the bickering could escalate further. Carrying a metal panel, she set it carefully on the ground near them, her tone patient but firm as she instructed each of them to place their hands on the crystal embedded within and infuse mana to power the device. Camus stepped forward without hesitation. His aura erupted in a sudden whirlwind that roared out of his body, funneling straight into the crystal. The clear gem lit with a deep gray hue, and at once, the panel beneath it hummed and clicked as its mechanisms whirred to life. Emily's eyes brightened with delight as she announced that the apparatus was powering on. Hester approached next, her composure steady as stone. She laid her hand against the crystal and whispered a single word. In response, fire surged outward, brilliant and fierce, yet not a single lick of heat escaped her control. Arthur observed in silence, struck by the flawless mastery she displayed over her element. Bund's booming voice declared his turn as he flexed his fingers theatrically. Emily attempted to remind them that the device was not meant to be part of a competition, but Bund brushed the warning aside with a grin, insisting that to a true man, everything was a contest. As he placed his hand against the crystal, the ground split beneath his feet, jagged cracks spreading outward in a display of raw earth affinity power. The panel shuddered under the force, vibrating audibly before the gem steadied and drew in his mana. Emily called at last for Princess Caitlin. The young conjurer tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, her movement delicate yet assured. The air grew colder as Princess Caitlin released her mana. Frost thickened around her, weaving into serpentine shapes that writhed gracefully through the haze before sliding down her arm and vanishing into the crystal. The device pulsed in response, its glow sharpened by her controlled power. Emily, barely containing her excitement, pressed the crystal fully into the panel. At once, the entire chamber shifted, the walls and ceiling alive with light and patterns, the hum of energy vibrating through the space. Alanis, however, spoke with composure, promising that explanations would follow. For now, she urged them to begin. Arthur asked how the training should start. Hester's calm voice answered that it would begin the way all great training did. Bund finished the thought with a booming grin, declaring that it would start by Arthur getting beaten up. The combined pressure of their presence pressed against Arthur like a tangible weight, sharp and suffocating. Yet instead of dread, exhilaration coursed through him. A smile tugged at his lips as he slid into a defensive stance. He was ready. Far away, in a very different field of battle, Tessia's vines lashed out with precision, snatching Darvis's axe clean from his grip. His cry of frustration was met with roaring laughter as Stannard and Karaya doubled over at the sight of their companion disarmed so easily, the sound of their amusement echoing through the clearing. Tessia's lips curved into a gentle smile as she corrected Darvis, reminding him that he needed to keep a tighter grip on his weapon. With that, she announced the end of their training session. Darvis clicked his tongue in frustration, vowing that one day he would surpass her. The moment was interrupted when a young elf hurried toward her, calling out respectfully. He held a sealed transmission scroll, which he offered to her with a bow. Tessie accepted it with thanks, her curiosity sharpening as she broke the seal. Her eyes scanned the familiar handwriting, her grandfather's words greeting her warmly. He wished her well and assured her that the castle remained secure. Her heart lifted as she read the news that Arthur had recovered. He would be remaining in the castle for the next 2 months to focus on training, though, as her grandfather admitted, Arthur had tricked him into allowing it. Her pulse quickened at the list of those who would be training alongside him. The names carried weight: Hester, Camus, Bund, elders and warriors of great skill. But when her gaze reached the final name, her breath caught. It was Princess Caitlin. Back in the training room, the elders wasted no time. The moment Arthur signaled his readiness, Hester advanced, conjuring a sphere of fire in her palm. With a sharp flick of her wrist, the globe hurtled toward him, swelling larger as it closed the distance. Arthur turned to counter, but the ground beneath his feet shifted violently, throwing him off balance. Bund's aura shimmered yellow across his hands, his interference pulling the terrain against Arthur with mocking precision. The sudden disruption left Arthur scant moments to react. He twisted mid-fall, calling Dawn's ballad from his ring. As his body hit the dirt, he swept the blade in a wide arc, releasing a shockwave of frost. The icy force exploded outward, colliding with the fireball in a detonation of steam and embers that vanished before they could consume him. Struggling back to his feet, Arthur steadied himself. Bund's grin stretched wider, the dwarf's amusement plain as his eyes gleamed. Even before Arthur could find stable footing, a new pressure surged against him. Camus released a sudden burst of wind, the force threatening to hurl him across across the floor. Arthur stabbed the fractured tip of his sword into the ground, anchoring himself with sheer will as the gale tore past. When the gust finally relented, Arthur looked up. Dozens of icicles, long and jagged as spears, whistled through the air toward him, summoned with ruthless intent. Mana surged within him. Drawing deep from his core, he swept his free arm outward and released a wave of fire. Flames roared across the training ground, meeting the frozen barrage. The icicles evaporated in an instant, melting into hiss and vapor before they could pierce his flesh. Hester's grin widened with delight as she unleashed a torrent of blue fire. The unnatural flames roared across the chamber, their brilliance unlike anything Arthur had seen before. His eyes widened in shock. Blue flames! From the edge of the training ground, Emily observed with unrestrained excitement. She remarked on how rare it was to see Arthur struggle so much. Alanis, standing beside her, commented on how much she seemed to be enjoying the display. Emily confessed without hesitation, her tone light but mischievous, that she secretly hoped Arthur would take an even harsher beating, for the sake of science, of course. Arthur clenched his jaw as he parried Flame with Frost, his thoughts turning sharply. Each elder carried the weight of battle experience in their movements. Yet what unsettled him more was how seamlessly their attacks meshed together. They were not simply striking at random, they were coordinated. Before he could counter, the earth convulsed beneath him. 3 massive slabs of stone erupted upward, slamming shut into a triangular formation around him. The walls locked into place, sealing him inside a pyramid of earth. His vision of the battlefield vanished. Frustration welled in his chest. This was getting irritating. Outside, Bun's booming laughter rattled the walls as he declared triumph. Camus' voice followed, his tone laced with disdain as he questioned whether this struggling figure was truly the prodigy Virion had gathered them all to train. Arthur snapped his fingers, summoning a small flame to illuminate the earthen prison. The flickering light revealed walls that converged high above, their peak narrowing at least 20 feet overhead. He slid Dawn's ballad back into his ring, deciding this time to fight like a true conjurer. Channeling earth mana into the ground, he reached outward with his senses. A faint ripple of awareness spread through the soil, mapping the field around him. In moments, he could discern the locations of all 4 elders. 2 more signatures lingered farther back, watching, Emily and Alanis. Almost at once, the walls responded. Spikes of stone burst forth, jutting toward him in relentless waves. Bund must have realized what he was attempting. Arthur smirked despite the pressure. Crafty dwarf. The spikes pushed closer, converging. Time had run out. It was now or never. Arthur expanded the small flame he had conjured for light, feeding it until it burned brighter. With his other hand, he summoned a surge of frost. Forcing the opposing elements together, he released them in unison, generating a violent rush of steam that filled every corner of the earthen prison. The vapor hissed outward, pressing through the cracks. Outside, Hester's sharp voice carried a warning. She urged caution, noting the steam's escape, then instructed Kathleen to seize the advantage the moisture offered. Kathleen raised her hand in response, frost spiraling around her wrist as she prepared to strike. Yet before she could release it, Arthur acted. Lightning, coiled tightly within him, erupted in a sudden discharge. Sparks crawled across his body before exploding outward, ripping through the ground and the walls alike. The pyramid shattered instantly, stone crumbling as arcs of electricity tore it apart. Dust and debris rolled across the training field in thick clouds. Through the haze, Camus emerged. The elder elf moved with measured purpose, swirling gales wrapping around his arms. Without a word, he thrust them forward, unleashing a blast of wind that struck Arthur with crushing force. The gale hurled him back, straight into the path of Hester. She was waiting for him, a globe of sapphire fire already formed, burning with unnatural brilliance. Arthur twisted midair, but there was no time to evade. The flames engulfed him fully, swallowing his form in their dazzling blue. Kathleen's breath caught as her hand reached instinctively toward him. For a few terrible seconds, she saw only fire consuming him. Then the inferno shifted. The flames curled and swirled unnaturally, drawn away from Arthur's body. When the blaze finally split apart, Arthur stood within the dispersing cone, intact except for the singed ends of his long hair. Relief washed over Kathleen as she realized he had somehow unraveled the attack himself. Bund clapped Kathleen lightly on the back, his laugh booming as he reassured her that there was nothing to worry about. Hester's eyes, however, narrowed in appraisal. She acknowledged Arthur's feat, but reminded him sharply that he was taking them too lightly. Bund agreed with her without hesitation. Hester's words lingered, sharp with warning, that if Arthur's display was all he could offer, 2 months would never be enough. Camus let out a languid yawn, his indifference deliberate as he remarked that it was hard to feel motivated against someone holding back so clearly. Arthur admitted the truth with quiet composure. He had a habit of matching his opponent's level, gauging their strength before committing. It was a flaw, one he recognized. Then the ground seemed to tremble. Mana erupted from him in a surge, violent and overwhelming, as if a dam had broken and released a torrent. The wave rolled across the training grounds, raw and unrestrained. Kathleen staggered back instinctively, her breath catching at the force of it. Camus snapped to attention, all traces of lethargy gone. Hester and Bund responded instantly, their auras thickening around them like shields. Arthur's voice rang staying steady through the storm of energy. He promised not to use this form again for the remainder of their training, but today, as the purpose was simply to acquaint themselves, he would allow himself to fight without restraint. Kathlyn's gaze locked on him as he turned, and in that instant, his eyes met hers. Amethyst. Radiant. Otherworldly. Impossible to describe. Ethereal, perhaps. Entrancing, certainly. None of those words truly captured the way they pierced through her, stirring something deep in her chest. She remembered seeing this form once before, during his duel with Lucas at Xyrus Academy, but never had she been this close. Never had she felt it so intensely. Bond's booming laugh shattered the silence, full of eager approval as he declared that this was more like it. Hester's voice rang sharp and commanding, ordering them to spread out as she vaulted backward, her spell already forming. The urgency in her tone revealed what they all knew. The advantage of numbers no longer mattered. Arthur's presence pressed down on them like a suffocating shroud, and for the first time, the balance had shifted. Kathlyn felt the familiar whisper inside her mind, the same one that always clawed at her in moments like this. It told her that resistance was futile, that nothing she did would matter against him. Her hands trembled slightly before she crushed the thought. No, not again. She would not allow herself to yield to doubt. Kathlyn steadied her breath, regaining composure as her gaze met Arthur's once again. His eyes lingered on her, sharp and knowing, as though he had sensed the distraction clouding her thoughts. In the next instant, his figure vanished, leaving only a charred footprint and the faint crackle of electricity in the hardened earth. When her eyes tracked his movement, Elder Camus was already soaring through the air, struck by Arthur's sudden attack. The ground shifted beneath the elf, molding itself into a soft cradle of earth to cushion his fall. Determination surged through Kathlyn as she forced aside hesitation. She shaped water into a colossal spear of ice. With a flick of her hand, the frozen weapon launched forward. Elder Camus, recovering swiftly, added his own wind to her magic, accelerating the spear beyond what she alone could achieve. Together, their cooperative strike spiraled through the air, vicious and precise, aimed directly at Arthur. He did not flinch. Arthur stood rooted, one hand raised as if in casual defiance, eyes locked on the attack. Kathlyn's breath caught in disbelief. Was he truly not going to evade? At the final instant, the spear disintegrated. The ice shattered midair, fragments dissolving before they could pierce his defense. Camus cast her a sharp look, suspicion flickering in his eyes as though questioning if she had sabotaged her own magic. She quickly shook her head, brows drawn tight in confusion. Whatever had happened, it had not been her doing. Elder Bund broke the silence with a thunderous stomp. The earth trembled, rising up at his call as a massive boulder tore free from the ground. His booming voice demanded more from Arthur, taunting him that changing the color of his hair and eyes could not be his only feat. Arthur's answering smile curved with wicked promise. In a flash, his body blurred. A shockwave of mana burst outward, crashing toward Bund. Yet the dwarf was ready. The massive boulder at his side shifted, reshaping itself under his will into a towering shield of stone that braced for impact. A crater split open where Arthur's shockwave had collided with Bund's shield. But the strike had been little more than a distraction. Before the dwarf could react, Arthur was already upon Hester, a lance of black lightning crackling in his hand. Kathlyn's chest tightened. He was too fast, far beyond her reach. Yet though she stood closer, Arthur had turned his assault on Hester instead. The familiar whisper stirred in her mind, cruel and mocking. He wasn't striking her because he feared hurting her. Her jaw clenched. She would not be pitied. Drawing in a sharp breath, she summoned the spell Vare had drilled into her again and again, though she had always disliked using it. Frost spread across her skin in shimmering layers, wrapping her frame in an icy mantle. Seraph of snow, the empowering chill coursed through her limbs. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, weaving into the chaos where Arthur fought all three elders at once. Camus danced on the wind, blades of air slicing at Arthur and cushioning his allies whenever he cast them aside. Bund pressed in with relentless force, while Hester's flames burned bright sapphire. Through the storm, Kathlyn struck. Her blade cut clean across Arthur's back, frost searing into the wound as blood crystallized instantly. His head whipped around, eyes wide, not with pain, but with surprise. Arthur retaliated with jagged shards of rock shattering through the icy armor encasing her, but she pressed on. She drove her other hand forward, releasing a burst of mana that struck against him. Arthur blocked, but the impact forced him back, straight into the roaring gale Camus had conjured. The wind caught him, spinning him wildly through the air. Bund was waiting. His fist drew back as the earth convulsed around him. Stone fragments swirled together, fusing into a massive gauntlet that encased his arm. Hester's flames surged, wrapping the earthen weapon in a sheath of sapphire fire. The strike landed with crushing force. The sound reverberated across the training ground as the flaming stone fist slammed directly into Arthur. Bund pulled back his massive fist, laughter booming as he shook off the lingering flames. The dwarf praised Kathlyn openly, declaring that the princess had saved the day, though he suspected Arthur had not truly fought at his full strength. Arthur pushed himself up from the crater his body had carved into the ground. His breathing was heavy, his tone even as he admitted the truth. He could not maintain that form indefinitely and had already been running low on energy. Still, his eyes found Kathlyn, and a faint grin broke through as he added that he had not expected her to strike with such precision, like some kind of ice ninja. Confusion flickered across Kathleen's face at the unfamiliar word, her lips parting as she repeated it in question. Arthur waved the thought away quickly, brushing it off with a sheepish note that he should not have underestimated her, nothing more. Heat crept into her cheeks despite herself, the subtle praise lingering longer than she would admit. Soon the group reconvened near the entrance of the training room, where Emily and Alanis waited. Emily's enthusiasm brimmed as she declared the foremost concern for all of them, particularly Arthur, was safety during training. Bowen scoffed, arms crossed, claiming there was little need for Arthur to worry about killing them when his strength was obvious. Emily clapped her hands together, unfazed. She explained that the problem would not persist for long. She was working on a device designed to trigger a defense mechanism that would prevent lethal blows. The dwarf's eyes gleamed at once with interest. He remarked that such an artifact could prove invaluable if equipped to every soldier. Alanis, ever composed, interjected with practicality. She reminded them that the device relied on phoenix worm scales, rare, costly materials. The Glader family had provided a few as gifts, but widespread use would be astronomically expensive. She added that beyond cost, the difference between training and battle could not be ignored. In training, an opponent would stop once the defense activated. On the battlefield, an enemy would simply strike again. Arthur shifted in the strange leather and wire armor, his gaze sweeping across the plates mounted along the walls. His tone carried suspicion as he questioned the purpose of both the odd outfit and the discs lining the chamber. Surely they were more than decoration. Emily's eyes gleamed with pride as she launched into explanation. Every detail, from the unflattering armor to the countless plates embedded across the room, was part of a single system. Together they recorded and measured the power of magic. The discs, she explained, contained sensors capable of gauging the force behind every spell cast within the chamber. She had named this measurement force per unit, or FFU. The glowing chains of mana, powered by the elders, linked each disc together, enabling her to track fluctuations in pressure when struck. Arthur, ever analytical, pressed further. He asked whether a spell that struck an opponent, say, a blast of wind against Elder Bund, would still be recorded if blocked. Emily's lips curved knowingly as she admitted that he had already found one of the system's flaws. Early trials had revealed the same issue. Spells disrupted or deflected during combat produced unreadable or inaccurate measurements. To solve it, she had covered the entire chamber, even beneath the floor, with discs. Mana trails threaded between them, creating a dense pressure network capable of reading a spell's force the moment it was formed, regardless of interception. Arthur summarized the explanation succinctly, likening it to covering the entire room in discs to create an area where mana could be measured. Emily shot him a dry look, lamenting that he had reduced 6 months of work into a single sentence. Still, a hint of pride softened her expression. Arthur acknowledged her achievement with sincerity, calling it a marvel that would accelerate the growth of mages everywhere, but his curiosity remained fixed on the armor itself. Emily explained that the suit had been designed to monitor mana flow through a single individual, whereas the discs represented an upgraded design for measuring large groups. The combination, however, offered maximum information. The armor's readings complemented Alanis' abilities perfectly. Alanis nodded as she elaborated that the armor amplified her capacity to take precise readings throughout Arthur's training, ensuring accuracy in their data. Arthur's tone carried quiet suspicion as he remarked that Alanis' explanation had been vague. If he hadn't known better, he might have thought she was concealing her ability on purpose, just as Emily had kept her invention hidden until its reveal. Alanis met the comment calmly, reminding him that his question had been about Emily's suit, not her own power. Still, she offered that if he was curious, he need only ask directly. Arthur accepted, his gaze steady. He asked her plainly what her ability was. Alanis folded her hands and explained without hesitation. By making physical contact, she could channel nature affinity mana to observe the flow of another's mana with great precision. Bund chuckled at her phrasing, his grin laced with innuendo, though no one indulged it further. Arthur, however, pressed with curiosity, asking whether this made her a deviant of nature magic. Alanis admitted she was uncertain. Perhaps it was an evolved form, perhaps a specialized extension of nature magic. Whatever its origin, she assured them that it had proven invaluable in assisting other lances. Hester, her tone both curious and analytical, asked what Alanis' sensory magic revealed about Arthur himself. Alanis gestured to the armor Emily had provided. With its aid, she explained she had been able to measure Arthur's mana flow accurately. She reported that his augmentation, transfer from core to extremities, took roughly 0.46 seconds, remarkably efficient, yet when casting spells, his timing varied. Wind magic took nearly 40% longer, while earth magic lagged by over 55% compared to his dominant affinities, ice and lightning. Fire and water had not been used enough during their session to produce reliable readings. Bund scoffed, calling the tool useless. Hester dismissed him immediately, countering that the device could even measure how quickly he could run on his short stubs of legs. The dwarf bristled, snapping back with thunder in his voice that running was beneath him. Why waste effort when the earth itself could carry him wherever he pleased? He flung the insult back, calling her an old witch, while Hester's smirk only deepened. Arthur watched the exchange quietly, his thoughts turning inward. The elders bickered like rivals, yet during the spar they had displayed remarkable coordination, moving as though bound by an unspoken rhythm. It was difficult to tell whether their sharp words were sparks of rivalry or the ease of long-forged friendship. Camus spoke with a measured tone, suggesting that he would personally acquire materials so as not to burden Emily further with requests. Emily waved off the concern with enthusiasm, assuring him it was no problem. She already had several unfinished prototypes, and producing more would hardly be a strain. Arthur leaned closer to Kathleen, lowering his voice. His expression carried both curiosity and caution as he asked what the exchange was about. A faint rush of steam escaped from Kathleen's lips as she exhaled, her gaze shifting downward before she explained. Camus had asked whether Miss Emeria could conduct mana flow readings for multiple individuals, not just one. Arthur's focus returned to Alanis. He asked for his own results, specifically after his transformation, when his hair and eyes had changed. Alanis answered carefully. General Arthur's spellcasting efficiency, she reported, had increased nearly fivefold across all elemental spectrums. Bond leaned in impatiently, demanding what else she had seen. Alanis hesitated before apologizing. She admitted she had been unable to measure Arthur's body augmentation in that state. Under normal conditions, his augmentation speed rivaled that of most lances, but during his transformation, it had been far too fast for her to even attempt a reading. The day's training came to an end soon after. Arthur and Kathleen left the chamber together, the weight of silence stretching between them as they walked the corridor side by side. Arthur broke the quiet, turning to her with a tentative question about her brother. Kathleen answered with composure. Curtis, she explained, was serving as an assistant instructor at Lansler Academy. His condition had improved now that their father permitted him to leave the castle, though still under supervision, of course. Arthur's tone edged with quiet curiosity as he suggested she had not been as fortunate as her brother. Kathleen's lips pressed together before she admitted softly that she had once hoped becoming stronger as a mage would grant her freedom. Yet her father still regarded her as a timid little princess. Arthur responded with a half smile, pointing out that she was, in truth, rather reserved. Her chin lifted, eyes flashing briefly with resolve as she insisted she had changed. She explained that she had become more outgoing, even revealing that her role as his sparring partner had been at her own insistence, though her voice faltered before the words were finished. Heat rushed to her cheeks, silencing her before she could continue. Arthur caught the slip immediately. Teasing her with a grin, he asked just how insistent she had been. Kathleen stumbled over her response, fumbling for composure. She managed to say it had simply been an excuse to escape her endless studies, nothing more. Arthur's thoughts shifted inward, amusement tugging at him. Kathleen had always been one to keep to herself, quiet and restrained. Yet now she carried herself with an air that was different, confident, poised, almost haughty in appearance. To someone who didn't know her, she might easily be mistaken for one of the many arrogant nobles who strutted through palace halls. She turned suddenly, her amethyst eyes sharp with concern, asking if something was wrong or if something was on her leg. Arthur straightened quickly, fumbling out a reassurance that everything was fine. Kathleen studied him for a moment before confessing she had not been sure he was still walking behind her. His footsteps, she explained, were unnervingly quiet. Arthur smirked at the observation, pointing out that the same could be said of her. For all the confidence in her stride, her steps seemed so light they barely touched the floor. Her expression softened at the memory that followed. Their mother, she explained, had been unrelenting when it came to their demeanor. Every aspect of behavior, every movement that might be seen by others had been under strict scrutiny. Both she and Curtis had endured rigorous lessons in royal etiquette, training that had shaped every gesture, every step. Arthur brightened as the conversation drifted to familiar ground, remarking that his mother had once enrolled Ellie in etiquette classes when she was younger. Kathleen tilted her head slightly, recalling the name. She asked if Ellie was his sister, short for Eleanor. Arthur nodded, explaining that Ellie often spent her days in the courtyard, practicing archery. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he added that he would have to introduce them properly sometime. Ellie would be thrilled to meet her. The corner of Kathleen's mouth curved into a genuine smile. She admitted she would like that. Arthur's tone softened as he asked if she had grown close to anyone else in the castle since the war had drawn so many together. Kathleen shook her head gently, confessing she still saw the same familiar faces as before. Surprise flickered across Arthur's expression. He pressed further, pointing out her guardian, Hester, someone he had not seen prior to recent days. Kathleen explained that Hester had been a presence for most of her life, though not in ways visible to others. She had not accompanied her to school, but her role as guardian had always been constant. Arthur considered the bond carefully, then asked whether she had any connection to Bund. Kathleen confirmed it with quiet certainty, adding that all three elders knew each other well. Her voice carried the weight of memory as she explained further. During the last war between humans and elves, Darv had sent soldiers to aid Sapin, which was how Hester and Bund first formed their connection. When the conflict ended, leaders from all three kingdoms had been required to attend summits every few months. In those times, Hester had often spoken of both Bund and Camus, recalling their names and their frequent training together. Arthur remarked that the elders' shared history explained their uncanny coordination during the spar. Stopping outside Kathleen's chambers, he asked if she would be alright on her own. She lifted a pendant from around her neck, the faint gleam of its surface familiar. Her voice carried calm assurance as she explained that her father had taken extra precautions, reinforcing her room, and she also had this to protect her. Arthur's eyes lingered on the pendant. Recognition stirred immediately. Crafted from phoenix worm scales, its beauty was unmistakable. Kathleen seemed faintly surprised at his quick observation, but she nodded with approval. Gideon, she explained, had fashioned it using both a worm core and scales. Her expression softened with gratitude as she thanked him for escorting her, noting that without him, Hester would have insisted on accompanying her instead. Arthur brushed it off, insisting it was no trouble. He had another errand to see to anyway, and after all, escorting her was the least he could do in return for her support during training. Kathleen countered gently, reminding him that the session served her as well. There was no need to thank her. He inclined his head in acknowledgement, his tone steady as he suggested they both continue to train hard and grow stronger. With that, he wished her good night. As he turned away, her voice followed him faintly, barely audible, a quiet murmur of farewell. Arthur's steps carried him down into the cells of the floating castle. The air grew colder, quieter, as stone corridors swallowed the sounds of his passage. He came to a halt before the familiar bars where Mika rested, dozing lightly with a book in her hands. The hinges groaned as the cell door creaked open. He greeted Mika. She stirred, her lips curving faintly in a weary smile as she called him a sight for sore eyes. Arthur's chest tightened with guilt as he apologized for not visiting sooner. He wished he could do more for her, but the council had insisted her case be examined with absolute scrutiny before her release could even be considered. Mika listened, then tried to offer him advice on gravity magic, yet her explanation spilled out in tangled, nonsensical fragments, leaving him struggling to follow her reasoning. Arthur reassured Mika that it would not be much longer before Virian's team gathered enough evidence to secure her release. Mika laughed in her usual chirpy voice, brushing off his concern. She told him not to worry, urging him to focus on what he needed to do. Then, her tone shifted, her small frame bursting with sudden energy as she raged against the injustice. She placed all the blame squarely on Rhadeus, calling him the old bastard responsible for her situation. Arthur softened the moment with quiet humor, remarking that Rhadeus' cell was far less comfortable than hers. Mika waved animatedly as she retreated back into the confines of her cell, lamenting that being alone without magic was unbearably dull. She called out for him to get her out soon. Arthur offered her a smile in return, promising he would. Later, back in his chamber, he washed the weight of the day from his face and sat on the edge of his bed. His gaze fell on the horns of Uto resting heavily before him. A troubled thought pressed against his chest. He could not help anyone as he was now. Not without Realm Heart. Even then, the strain of maintaining it left him vulnerable. A twitch stirred from the bed nearby. Sylvie's body shifted, stretching slowly. Her small voice carried warmth as she asked if he had rested well. Arthur looked toward her, relief softening his expression. She stretched languidly, remarking that she felt almost able to move normally again. But her gaze flicked toward the horns, and caution entered her tone. She asked if it was truly safe to trust the scythe who had left them such a gift. Arthur considered carefully. The treaty forbade the Asuras from aiding Dicathen, yet Ceres had spared him when she could have struck him down. That choice carried weight. He confessed that without her intervention, he doubted he and Sylvie could have defeated Udo at all. Sylvie's eyes lingered on him as she spoke with quiet resolve. Their enemies would only grow stronger as they did. If the horns could help him ascend to the White Core, then it would be a gain not just for him, but for both of them. Arthur steadied his breath, setting his resolve. One horn would be enough for him. The other, he told Sylvie, should be hers. She was still in the awakening process Lord Indrath had insisted upon. For weeks, she had been unconsciously drawing in ambient mana, but it left her drowsy and drained. Drawing mana directly from Udo's horn would hasten that process. Sylvie hesitated, her voice quieter now. She confessed that she had not been trying as hard as she could. Fear weighed heavily on her. Fear that once she awakened as a full Ashura, she might no longer be able to remain by his side. Growing stronger would make it harder to conceal her identity, harder to live unnoticed. Arthur's eyes darkened as he recalled the battlefield. She had nearly died in their last fight. Whatever awaited them when she awakened, they would face it together, as they always had. The words came firm, certain. She agreed softly, her faith steady. They always did. The two of them turned their attention to the horns, each focused on one, channeling their mana toward the dense core of power sealed within. Arthur searched, probing for something he could extract, but felt nothing. Across from him, Sylvie's aura shifted, a flicker of success, suggesting she had found a thread of energy to pull. Arthur inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Mana coiled around his frame, ether ether gathering at his palm as the horn began to glow. Then it struck. A searing shriek of pain tore through him, forcing his hand violently back. His chest heaved with ragged breaths as he stared at his palm, the spot where his etheric gem had once been embedded. The ether had flared there, raw and agonizing. His teeth clenched as he muttered bitterly. That damned acolyte weapon, the burden it had left behind, always interfering with his core. He could only hope it would prove worth the suffering. Exhaling heavily, Arthur collapsed back against his bed. Weariness swallowed him whole, and before long, exhaustion pulled him under into restless sleep. Cadet Gray was summoned next, his name echoing across the chamber as the researcher on the other side of the glass directed him to the platform. The sphere placed before him was explained as a device meant to gauge the depth of his Kai, and he was instructed to channel his energy into it until told to stop. Drawing in a steady breath, Gray drew Ki from deep within his core, guiding the flow upward through his chest and into his right arm until it touched the smooth glass surface. The orb absorbed his energy, glowing faintly as the seconds stretched on. Beads of sweat gathered at his brow, and his hand began to tremble against the sphere long before a full minute had passed. When the researcher finally gave the order to halt, his voice carried no note of praise, only a detached sense of disinterest, as if unimpressed by the effort shown. Stepping away, Gray moved down the brightly lit corridor until he reached the end of a line, joining the cadets who awaited the last stage of the assessment. The broad-shouldered young man standing in front of him shifted uneasily, his nervousness betraying itself in the restless movement of his arms. His words revealed curiosity about the final trial, though the answer was clear to Gray. They had already been tested for intellect, strength, and Kai reserves. The only trial left was combat itself. Though his Kai was lacking compared to others, he held quiet confidence in his ability to fight. The line advanced, leading them into a wide auditorium where groups of cadets had already assembled beneath the guidance of instructors. One man, stern and composed, stepped forward to address them. He introduced himself as Instructor Gredge and outlined the trial awaiting them. This final stage, he explained, would be practical combat. Their Ki levels would not be announced, for every warrior must adapt to the uncertainty of battle. One might face an opponent barely able to harden a fist, or another whose reservoir of energy far surpassed their own. The true measure would not be strength alone, but the ability to adapt and to prevail. The instructor's words were laced with weight. Success in the exam meant access to resources that could shape their future, while failure promised neglect and eventually expulsion. With that grim reminder, he declared the combat to begin. Gray quietly studied the cadets around him. Here, none concealed their lineage or power. Many bore the emblems of military families, children trained from birth for this very path, some perhaps groomed as candidates for kingship itself. Two cadets clashed in the arena, their weapons striking with raw force. The boy faltered under the pressure, collapsing onto his back. Before he could recover, the girl sprang forward, spear in hand, driving it downward with intent to finish. Instructor Gredge intercepted her weapon mid-motion, halting the strike just as it descended. The match was declared over, and both cadets were dismissed back to the group. The next names were called Gray and Vlaire of House Ambrose. Both stepped into the arena, facing one another under the watchful eyes of their peers. At Gredge's signal, the duel began. Vlaire moved first, lunging with speed that blurred his weapon through the air. Gray, already reading the trajectory, tilted his head just enough to let the thrust pass, then dipped low to avoid the swift follow-up swipe. The exchanges grew sharper, Vlaire's skill and precision undeniable, yet Gray continued to evade without expending his Kai. He knew well that one clean strike from his opponent would end the match, but conserving his limited energy was the only way to seize a true opening. To him, Vlaire's movements, despite the power behind them, seemed just a step too slow. As the duel stretched on, Vlaire's perfect rhythm began to fracture, emotion bleeding into his strikes. Gray seized the moment, launching forward with a flying kick that landed squarely against his opponent's ribs. The impact forced Vlaire back, his body staggering under the blow. Without pause, Gray followed with a clean strike of his sword just beneath the armpit, forcing the young Ambrose to skid further across the arena floor. Teeth clenched, Vlaire steadied himself, his frustration clear. Instructor Gredge raised his hand, voice sharp as he declared the match over. Vlaire's protest came instantly, his pride unwilling to accept the conclusion. He insisted the exchange had been nothing more than a lucky strike and claimed he could still continue. Gredge's tone, edged with annoyance, dismissed the argument. There would be no victory or defeat in these sparring matches, only observation. He had seen enough to judge both cadets, and that was final. Vlaire cast Gray a resentful glance, unwilling to concede, but Gredge silenced him with the truth of the matter. Gray had landed a decisive blow after evading every attack for exactly 1 minute and 8 seconds. The instructor warned him further, threatening to dock points if he delayed the proceedings any longer. Reluctantly, Vlaire was ordered out of the arena, making way for the next pair of cadets. The exams concluded swiftly, leaving the cadets with a brief window to rest and eat as the results were prepared for display. Gray sat quietly at a table when a familiar voice broke through the hum of the hall. Nico slid into the seat across from him, elbow brushing Gray's arm in his usual casual manner. Cecilia followed soon after, taking her place beside him. Gray asked about their performance, particularly whether the amulet had worked as intended. Cecilia admitted that it had, noting that the examiner's expressions placed her somewhere between average and not particularly above it. Nico, ever quick with humor, laughed at the outcome, remarking that he should have named his creation the non-significantly above average key displayer. Pride flickered in his tone, for he had once again managed to shield Cecilia from unnecessary scrutiny. Gray observed them, his thoughts heavy. He remembered Nico's resilience after Wilbeck's death, how he had been the first to recover and had pulled Gray back up with him. There was a strength in Nico that went beyond inventions, a strength that found ways to protect the people he cared about. Even so, Gray sighed inwardly. He still believed it would have been safer if Nico and Cecilia had chosen an ordinary school instead of joining him here. It was not too late for them to reconsider, but Nico brushed such worries aside with cheerful certainty, declaring that they would stick together. Gray reminded them that the academy offered more than just combat training. Its advanced research facilities and engineering workshops held promise for Nico's talents as well. Cecilia agreed, her voice calm yet firm, affirming that they each had something to learn in this place. Reluctantly, Gray relented, though caution lingered in his words. The memory of that night still weighed on him, and he knew they had yet to uncover who had truly been after Cecilia. Nico dismissed the concern lightly, insisting that the Kai restrainer would last long enough for him to gather the parts he needed to construct a more stable one. With that, he shoved his tray aside, unimpressed by the academy's food, and proposed that they head out early to the results board. Gray agreed, and together, the three of them left the hall, stepping outside toward the board where their futures at the academy awaited. As they walked together, Gray asked Nico whether the engineering cadets were separated into divisions like the martial ones. Nico tilted his head thoughtfully before explaining. The intellectual cadets still needed to use KI to power their tools and inventions, so those with larger reserves were favored. But unlike the martial divisions, Ki was not weighed as heavily. He expected to be placed either in the first division, the fast track, or the second. Cecilia listened with quiet envy and remarked that things were not so simple for martial cadets. Their system stretched all the way down to the 5th division, a structure that made advancement harder and pressure greater. Nico only shrugged at that reality, then added with a grin that he hoped the two of them would at least end up in the same division or even the same class. That way, Gray could keep unwanted attention away from Cecilia. By the time they reached the courtyard where the results would be posted, the space was already packed with cadets pressing toward the board. The crowd murmured impatiently, everyone eager to glimpse their fate. Cecilia noted dryly that it seemed every cadet had thought the same as they did. With no other option, Nico urged Gray forward, calling for him to lead the way through the throng. The press of bodies was chaotic, and in the struggle to move closer, Cecilia's attention was drawn to Nico. A thin line of blood marked his lip, and she immediately asked if he had been struck. Nico, ever the dramatist, claimed he had taken a stray elbow in defense of her. Gray only shook his head, recognizing the truth behind the act. Nico chewed at his lip whenever nerves got the better of him, and this time he had bitten down too hard. Nico clicked his tongue in annoyance at being exposed, muttering a wordless retort as the three of them pushed their way toward the front. The screen in the courtyard flickered to life, announcing the cadets' placements. Nico Sever's name appeared at the top, Division 1, the highest tier. Cecilia followed in Division 2, Class 4. When Gray finally found his own name, the word struck him like a weight, Division 4, Class 1. He whispered it over in his mind again and again, almost unwilling to believe. His path toward excelling in the academy growing stronger, and avenging Headmaster Wheelbeck suddenly felt steeper than ever. Arthur's eyes crept open to the familiar ceiling of his room in the floating castle. Relief came with the realization that this time, at least, he had not awoken from another nightmare. Sylvie, watching from nearby, sensed the unrest in his sleep and noted how much he had tossed and turned. She wondered if he had been haunted again by memories of his past life. Arthur reassured her gently, telling her to focus on recovery while he returned to training. He rose, stepped into the hallway, and walked its quiet stretch until Virion came into view at the far end. Thoughts of his recurring dreams weighed heavily on him, questions circling without answer. Virion, noticing his distracted expression, asked what occupied his mind. Arthur admitted only that he hoped all of their efforts would work as planned. Virion responded with calm assurance, reminding him that Alanis knew exactly what she was doing. Arthur then questioned why Virion had chosen to assign him a personal attendant so suddenly. Virion explained that after Alanis' service with the Lances, she had proven herself more than capable of supporting Arthur's growth. Before that, she had been stationed along Elenoir's southern border, where he had once encountered her during a corrupted beast ambush. Though she had been serving as a nurse, her deviant magic had displayed an extraordinary quality. She could could instantly evaluate the flow of mana in others and identify its weaknesses, even in the lances themselves. By doing so, she guided them to strengthen where they faltered. That ability, Varian concluded, made her the perfect choice to ensure Arthur's recovery, and training during his break would not be wasted. She was the one he had personally approved. Arthur's frustration slipped into his voice as he questioned whether all of Varian's arrangements were simply to improve the old commander's image. Before his irritation could linger, Alanis entered quietly, a parchment in her hands. Arthur caught himself and offered a quick apology, but she continued without pause, her tone calm yet firm. She explained that her contribution was far more than polishing Varian's reputation, then handed Arthur his training schedule for the next 7 weeks. The plan emphasized refining the speed of his mana flow during body augmentation and sharpening his spellcasting with his lesser elements. Arthur glanced over the details, noting that the first 2 weeks would be spent in one-on-one training. He wondered aloud if that was truly the best use of time. Alanis, precise and deliberate, reminded him of his stated goal to immerse himself in combat scenarios using various elements, both to strengthen the weaker ones and to identify which could be best applied through different techniques in future battles. Though her explanation was technical, Arthur acknowledged she was correct. She regarded him steadily and remarked that while his willingness to use himself as a training dummy for this purpose was commendable, it was ultimately impractical. Arthur urged her to elaborate. Alanis did so without hesitation. His fighting style, she pointed out, was already too solidified. Though he had likely practiced by suppressing his strongest elements to force reliance on the lesser ones, in real combat he always reverted back to elemental integration with his strongest powers. To reshape that tendency, a slow and structured transition was required. More than that, unpredictability had to be introduced. For that reason, she laid out the design of his training. He would begin with one-on-one sparring against 4 different partners. They would rotate at random intervals, preventing him from adapting to any single style. In every session, one element would be forbidden to him, and that limitation would also change unpredictably. Arthur exhaled, realizing his original concept of simply fighting all 4 opponents at once had transformed into something far more intricate. What he had imagined as brainless sparring was now a layered and demanding trial. Varian remarked that Alanis' training regimens for the other lances had been equally complex. He promised to return later to observe Arthur's progress, then cautioned Alanis not to break him. He still had need of the boy. With a wry smile, the old elf bid them farewell. Arthur turned his attention to the training room, glancing around at the open space as he began to ask which opponent he would face first. Before the question could leave his lips, the ground beneath him erupted like a spring, launching him upward. Startled for an instant, he quickly recognized the handiwork of Bund. The dwarf stood waiting with an eager grin, arms spread wide as though expecting an embrace. His booming voice carried across the room, welcoming Arthur with playful enthusiasm. Arthur answered not with warmth but with action, conjuring fire as he dashed forward. Alanis' sharp command cut through the air, forbidding him from using fire or its deviant form. Arthur cursed under his breath and halted his strike, but in that brief hesitation, Bond seized control. The ground coiled around Arthur's legs, locking him in place as the dwarf tightened his hold. Shards of rock broke free at Bund's command, pelting forward, yet Arthur dropped low, pressing his palms against the floor. Frost surged from his hands, binding Bund's stance in icy layers before Arthur countered with a flurry of ice shards. From the sidelines, Hester's laughter echoed, while Camus observed with calm approval, noting how quickly the boy was adapting. Bund, however, was far from finished. The dwarf shaped the earth with precision, spikes rising to block the icy barrage before lunging forward, his booming challenge daring Arthur to do better. Arthur propelled himself skyward on a surge of wind, his body lifting above the strike. Even as he gained distance, he could not help but acknowledge the mastery displayed below. The way Bund shaped the earth was incredible, though it carried with it an undeniable flair for showmanship. Emily's voice carried across the training hall, noting how surprisingly well Arthur was adapting to Alanis' challenge. Bund pressed forward, rock hardening around his fist as he swung with crushing force. Arthur braced himself and caught the blow with a shield of frost, the impact echoing through the chamber. In retaliation, pillars of stone erupted around him, forming a cage that threatened to close him in. Arthur countered with a surge of earth and mana, forcing a pillar beneath his feet to rise and launch him upward, breaking free of the prison. Just as he prepared to strike at Camus, Alanis' firm voice cut through the clash, calling for a switch. She announced Hester as the next opponent. A surge of fire burst to life as Hester stepped in, blue embers spiraling dangerously around her wrists. From behind, Bund muttered his dissatisfaction, grumbling that he had wanted the spar to last longer. Alanis, unfazed, ordered Arthur to restrict his water magic for this session. Though Arthur lacked Realm Heart to track mana fluctuations with clarity, his body, strengthened through Sylvia's dragon will, sensed danger instinctively. He pushed himself backward just in time as a violent detonation of fire erupted at the spot he had stood moments before. The blast shook the room, filling the air with smoke that quickly obscured his view. Arthur realized at once that Hester had not expected to strike him directly. The blast was a ploy to conceal her movements. Refusing to give her the advantage, he swept his arms through the lingering cloud, manipulating the dust and smoke into a sharp wave that he sent forward, hoping to break her line of concealment. As Arthur anticipated, Hester's form emerged from the haze, her body shielded behind a blazing panel of fire. It was his turn to counter. Channeling mana into his legs, he surged forward in a blur, blue flames gathering and coiling around his fists. He struck, intending to overwhelm her shield with the force of his flame. The fiery panel shattered under the blow, but Hester was no longer there. Blue fire suddenly swirled beneath him before erupting into a towering pillar of heat. For an instant, his vision was consumed by its brilliance. The world painted in searing blue as the blaze engulfed him. From the sidelines, Bond remarked on Hester's relentlessness, while Camus recalled the sting of once being caught in the same technique. Arthur's aura held against the inferno, granting him just enough time to bend the flames away, redirecting their heat before his defensive artifact could trigger and end the spar. The longer he endured, the more suffocating the heat became, but at last he shattered the pillar, dispersing the fire around him. Relief was short-lived. A dozen massive spheres of flame now hovered in the air, each one nearly 6 feet tall, their surfaces rippling with volatile energy. The sheer number tested his patience. If Hester's goal had been to frustrate him with distractions, she had succeeded. Planting his feet, Arthur conjured a series of earthen spikes that tore upward from the ground. Those that struck true pierced through the fiery orbs, scattering them in bursts of flame. Bond barked in protest, recognizing the mimicry of his own tactics, but Alanis countered coolly that this only proved Arthur was learning as intended. Arthur made a mental note to refine his aim with earth magic, knowing too many of the spikes had gone astray. Yet his small victory was fleeting. New orbs of fire appeared almost instantly, replacing those destroyed. Before he could mount another offensive, the globes pulsed with sudden brightness, then unleashed their barrage. From every direction, streams of fire hurtled toward him, forcing Arthur back into a desperate defense. Arthur's mind raced as the barrage pressed in from every side. He knew he could not remain on the defensive, but he had no way of discerning which fiery sphere concealed Hester. The temptation to unleash Realmheart gnawed at him, yet he resisted. It would only be a crutch, a reckless shortcut that devoured mana in exchange for clarity. He forced himself to think, if their roles were reversed, if he were Hester, what strategy would he use? The answer came quickly. He would aim to break his opponent's composure, to provoke impatience until a single mistake opened the way. So Arthur acted the part. A roar tore from his throat as he unleashed waves of wind and bursts of flame in wild arcs, hammering the orbs in what seemed like a desperate frenzy. From the sidelines, Emily questioned whether restricting his water and ice magic had been a mistake, but Camus dismissed her concern. To him, this disadvantage would only drive Arthur to adapt beyond his limits. Arthur's feigned agitation continued, but beneath it, his focus sharpened. Hester's mana pool was vast, her control remarkable, yet even she would tire. As the spheres began to undulate and shrink, their glow intensifying, Arthur realized they were preparing to release their stored power. It looked like a finishing strike. He surged forward, lightning coiling along his limbs, and cut through the storm of flame, striking at the orbs directly. Each blow scattered fire in all directions, yet his instincts reminded him that Hester would never allow herself to be truly exposed. This was the difficult part. A multi-elemental mage's true strength was not merely in knowing which element to wield, but in combining them at the precise moment for maximum effect. Maintaining a flaming barrier around himself, Arthur divided his concentration. Beneath his feet, the earth shifted and opened into a narrow hollow just large enough to conceal his body. His eyes locked on a fleeting silhouette moving through the veil of fire. Seizing the moment, he collapsed his fiery shield and dropped into the ground, sealing the earth above to bury himself completely. Hester slipped past the space he had abandoned, unaware. Then, with perfect timing, Arthur broke back through the surface. Bursting upward, he caught her off guard at last. Hester spun to meet Arthur's strike, but she was a breath too late. His fist shot forward, wreathed in frost and lightning, the tendrils tearing through the air to collide with her spell. The two forces merged violently, compressing into a blazing sphere of fire and lightning that expanded with unbearable brilliance. In the next heartbeat, the orb erupted, a thunderous explosion radiating outward with both of them at its center. When the smoke cleared, Arthur stood battered but upright, his aura still intact. Hester, however, had been thrown back. A faint pink glow enveloped her body, proof that her defensive artifact had triggered to shield her from the blow. Excitement bubbled from Emily at the sight. She praised the artifact's seamless performance, marveling at the strength of the phoenix worm scales woven into it. Ellie, standing nearby, frowned at the reaction. To her, it was troubling that anyone should sound surprised a device meant to keep her brother alive had functioned as intended. Emily hastily waved off the concern, clarifying that she wasn't surprised, only relieved there had been no unforeseen complications. Bond grumbled from the edge of the arena, demanding to know why he had not been given a defensive artifact of his own. Emily retorted that his impatience had robbed him of the chance. He had rushed into battle before she could provide him one. Arthur steadied himself, reassuring Ellie that he had not needed protection in the first place. Hester, though weary, smirked from where she stood, promising that he would need it the next time. Arthur leaned lightly against his sister, asking why she had come. Ellie admitted she had wanted to see his training, though from the the look of things, it was already finished. His gaze shifted then to Virion, who had returned unexpectedly. Arthur reminded him of the council meeting he was supposed to be attending, but the old elf shook his head. He had come with a private update, one Ellie was permitted to hear as well. His tone turned grave as he spoke. Supplies had to be delivered between Blackbend and the Wall, and the urgency of that mission could not be overstated. Their best warriors had been tasked with escorting the convoys. Though the additional protection had slowed attacks for a time, another had recently taken place. This time, the Twin Horns and Arthur's parents had been on duty. The weight of Virion's news pressed heavily on Arthur, leaving him restless through the night. At first light, he set out for Blackbend, determined to see for himself what had happened. Gideon sat at Arthur's side, already dozing, while Hester and Princess Catelyn rode with them. Arthur, however, was silent, his mind consumed by thoughts he could not set aside. Sylvie's voice broke into his reflection, her tone soft with concern. She asked if he was worried about his parents. Arthur admitted he was. There was a reason he had never wanted them drawn into the war. Sylvie reminded him gently that such things were beyond his control, as they had once discussed. He agreed, but the frustration lingered. Only a few weeks into their departure, and already they had been attacked. Questions swirled inside him, tightening like a knot. How quickly was this war accelerating? Who was striking the supply routes? Rebels, or Alacrians themselves? It seemed impossible for enemy forces to slip past the wall unnoticed, yet Arthur could not shake the possibility. If they had been using the gate and Dar for longer than expected, their reach might already extend farther than they imagined. The road between Blackbend and the Wall was nothing but flat exposed terrain, perfect ground for ambushes. Perhaps instead of weakening the wall directly, the Alacrians had begun targeting the supply lines, sending spies to cripple them from within. His thoughts were broken by Hester's dry question, asking if he was enjoying the scenery. Arthur's reply carried a faint edge of sarcasm, noting that there was nothing to enjoy. Still, he admitted he was surprised the two had chosen to accompany him on such a dull journey. Catelyn answered with calm conviction. As a member of the royal family, her presence would smooth the process, drawing fewer questions from those they met along the way. More than that, she confessed she disliked that ordinary citizens were forced to risk their lives for something as basic as securing supplies. Hester remarked on how unlikely it seemed for Alacrians to remain concealed in such open land. With trained guards posted on the routes, surely they would have been spotted. Arthur countered that visibility would mean little if the attackers came accompanied by hordes of mutant beasts. Catelyn, thoughtful and pragmatic, suggested relocating more soldiers to Blackbend and along the wall as vanguards to protect the supply lines. Gideon shook his head, reminding her of the limits they faced. There were not enough soldiers to spare, and Commander Virion placed his hope in the possibility that Gideon could devise some miraculous invention to solve the problem. He admitted he, in turn, hoped Arthur's unspoken idea would prove to be the answer, and asked if their young general was willing to share a hint. Arthur's only reply was that the terrain itself could be turned to their advantage. Gideon could only sigh at his cryptic confidence. The carriage jolted suddenly to a stop, throwing its passengers against their seats. Alarmed, Hester demanded an explanation from the coachman. The man apologized hurriedly, saying they had reached their destination, but that the sight ahead had unsettled the beasts pulling the carriage. Arthur leaned out the window, and his breath caught. The road before them was strewn with carnage. Dozens of soldiers lay motionless, their bodies mingled with the twisted remains of enemy beasts. The town beyond was scarred with devastation, smoke curling from shattered buildings. The group abandoned the carriage and moved swiftly on foot through the ruined streets until they reached a large tent where the injured were being treated. Inside, Arthur's eyes found the figures he had been searching for, his mother and father alive amidst the chaos. Catelyn's thoughts reeled at the sight around her. So many lives had been lost, and all for the sake of a single supply cart. Even as she struggled to grasp the weight of it, Arthur pushed past the others, his voice trembling with urgency as he called out to his parents, desperate to know if they were hurt. Relief washed over him when Alice assured him they were unharmed. None of the twin horns had suffered fatal injuries. Angela's tone carried frustration as she explained what had happened. The Alacrians had ambushed them after Reynolds had scouted ahead. In the chaos, not a single enemy had been slain. Helen added that Angela's earlier spell had stalled 5 deviant beasts long enough for Reynolds to return and strike them down. She teased bitterly that Reynolds had claimed the glory without so much as a scratch. Reynolds himself deflected the praise, his attention turning instead to Arthur. Surprise flickered in his eyes as he asked why his son had come, whether it was only to check on them. Catelyn stepped in, her voice steady as she clarified the truth. The council had prioritized the security of the supply route, and both Gideon and General Arthur had been tasked with evaluating it. Their mission was to create a device that would protect lives lives and preserve resources in the ongoing conflict. Reynold gave a small smile, remarking that it was easy to forget Arthur now stood among the council's inner circle. Helen, gentler in tone, reminded him that Arthur was not only a council member, but also their son. She urged Reynold to take a moment to reconnect with him while she filled the others in on the situation. Alice agreed, choosing to remain by Helen's side in case her companion overexerted herself. She promised Arthur they would talk later. Sylvie hopped lightly onto Hester's shoulder, her luminous eyes following Arthur. She told him she would stay behind to listen and share anything important he might miss, but reminded him of what they had spoken about earlier, that he could not control the choices his parents made. Arthur acknowledged the truth of her words, though his heart resisted them. With that, he and Reynolds stepped out of the tent. His father's expression softened with pride as he regarded him, the newest lance, already carrying the burden of official war duties. Arthur admitted quietly that while the responsibility was real, his father was right. He had also come simply to make sure his parents were safe. Reynolds reassured his son firmly, reminding him that they were strong because they were a team that always looked out for one another. That bond was what would keep them safe. Arthur nodded, acknowledging the truth of the words, though a darker thought pressed at the back of his mind. Strength did not guarantee survival. Countless strong people still perished in war. How could he ever make his father truly understand the weight of that fear? Reynolds shifted the subject, asking if Ellie knew about the attack. Arthur explained that she only knew there had been an ambush. Varian had assured her that none of the casualties belonged to the Twin Horns, so she had returned to training. He added that she had grown skilled with the bow and even voiced a desire to attend a magic academy. Reynolds smiled faintly, noting how lonely life in such a vast castle must be for a teenage girl. Arthur agreed, but admitted that her determination stemmed from something deeper than companionship alone. His father sighed, recognizing the difficulty of living in someone else's shadow, something he knew well himself. He hoped Ellie would find time to make friends while continuing to hone her magic. Arthur asked if his parents planned to visit soon. Reynolds' expression softened with regret as he admitted they longed to, but the escalation of war left little room for respite. Their duty kept them on the battlefield. Arthur felt words rise in protest, but swallowed them back. He refused to let the brief reunion end in argument. Instead, he allowed the moment to stretch, sharing quiet conversation and lingering in the comfort of their presence. When it came time to part, Arthur embraced his mother tightly before stepping away. He waved as his parents turned back toward their duties, his heart heavy with unspoken fear. If they insisted on continuing to risk their lives out here, then his plan had to succeed. It was the only way. Arthur returned to the carriage, and soon they arrived at a small part of the town. As they stepped out, Kathleen glanced at him and gently asked if he was truly content with such a brief reunion. Arthur answered with quiet acceptance. His parents needed to continue to the wall, and though the meeting had been short, seeing them alive was more than enough. Kathleen's offhand remark about visiting her brother and not missing him at all drifted through the group with a teasing chill. Arthur grimaced at the careless jest and quickly warned her not to speak like that directly to his sibling. Gideon, impatience edged in his voice, cut through the light banter and pressed Arthur about the plan he had been hinting at, the device that had been living in the young general's head. Kathleen echoed the curiosity, watching him with interest. Arthur produced a parchment and unrolled it, revealing the concept he had been guarding. He reminded Gideon of a prior claim. Combustium could power an entire vessel at full speed. From that kernel of an idea, he had envisioned a ship that would travel not by water, but across land. He called it a train. Gideon's confusion snapped into brash amusement. He barked a ridicule at the name, wondering which poor mana beast's backside had supplied such a term. Arthur met the mockery with a terse offer. Did he want the blueprints or not? Gideon lunged for the papers, snatching them from Arthur's hand. His curiosity quickly surrendered to excitement as he skimmed the designs. Hester, practical as ever, scolded him to at least step into a building before unfolding official documents. But Gideon could not contain himself. He fluttered the blueprint in the air, exhilaration lighting his features, and clapped a firm hand on Arthur's shoulder. The idea, he declared, would change everything. Linking Blackbend to Calberk or Exire by conventional rivers would be maddening. The waterways were inconsistent and would stymie rapid transport. Yet with a few water and earth mages assisting the construction, the possibilities shifted. Arthur cut through the sprawling visions and steered the conversation back to immediate priorities. Their focus had to be the railway between Blackbend and the Wall first. Establishing a reliable line there would protect the supply route and save lives. Only once that lifeline was secured should they expand to the other great cities. More broadly, Arthur emphasized, their paramount objective was the Grand Mountains. Fortify the path so troops could move and survive across the most dangerous stretches. Gideon's excitement mounted as he clutched the parchment, proclaiming that the invention would do more than secure supply lines. It could lead to the development of entirely new cities. Arthur, curious, asked what he meant. Kathleen explained that every major city across the three kingdoms had been built where teleportation gates had once been excavated, a secure means of transporting supplies, and people would free them from that limitation, allowing great cities to rise wherever they chose. Gideon, brimming with pride, agreed wholeheartedly, declaring he couldn't have explained it better himself. himself. Arthur allowed a chuckle, remarking that his ideas seemed destined to alter the course of history. Gideon bristled at the casualness, warning him not to say such flippant things to a renowned artificer, threatening half seriously to abandon his craft for a new hobby. Arthur brushed it aside, reminding him he had no choice but to stay. He would be the one presenting this idea to the council. The artificer's eyes widened at the responsibility. As much as he loved the spotlight, he asked why Arthur was letting him take the credit. Arthur explained his reasoning plainly. It would be easier to gain the council's support if the proposal came from a renowned artificer rather than from him. And besides, Gideon would be handling most of the work regardless. That was enough to spark another surge of energy in the old man. With a triumphant cry, Gideon dashed off with the blueprint in hand, promising not to let Arthur down and already plotting out the proposal. Hester shook her head as he disappeared, remarking dryly that the man seemed to live off nothing but adrenaline instead of sleep or sustenance. It was then that Kathleen spoke again, her voice more tentative. Rather than returning immediately, she suggested staying the night. The suddenness of her request left Arthur, Sylvie, and Hester equally surprised. Realizing how her words might have been misinterpreted, a flush colored her cheeks. She hurried to clarify, stammering that it wasn't what they thought. It had simply been a long day, and with nothing scheduled but training the next morning, she thought it would be nice to linger. She hadn't been to Black Bend in so long, and the city stayed lively well into the night. Couldn't they at least stay for dinner? Arthur pressed a hand against his mouth, struggling to suppress a laugh as he watched her flustered explanation. Kathleen flushed deeper when she noticed Arthur suppressing laughter. She demanded to know why, insisting her suggestion had been perfectly valid. Arthur's chuckle slipped free as he reassured her that he hadn't meant to mock the idea itself. What amused him was the thought of her, of all people, proposing to shirk duties for an evening of leisure. Turning to Hester, he asked if their mentor agreed they should enjoy the night and leave tomorrow's burdens for tomorrow. Hester cleared her throat with feigned solemnity, replying that if the general approved, then she would allow it, so long as Arthur paid for the drinks. Arthur promised they would order enough brews to make Bun jealous. A faint smile touched Hester's lips as she admitted to herself that she had never seen the princess so lively. For a fleeting moment, Kathleen reminded her of someone from long ago. Arthur, noting Kathleen's earlier glances, teased her that she had been eyeing a tavern and that this was her true reason for wanting to stay. Kathleen parried smoothly, remarking that a skilled politician knew when not to answer. Later, Arthur and Hester made their way into the tavern together. Arthur noticed Kathleen's absence and asked where she had gone. Hester explained that the princess was drafting proposals to nobles who might push forward Arthur's train project, or perhaps she was still brooding over the joke he had made earlier. Arthur frowned slightly, regretting the teasing remark about her eagerness to avoid training. Yet Hester surprised him. As one of the few allowed to jest with the princess, she encouraged him to continue doing so. Arthur raised a brow at that, noting it was an odd thing to hear from her loyal guard. Hester's expression softened as she explained that it came not as a soldier, but as someone who had watched over Kathleen for 15 years. She was glad Arthur treated her in a way that made her laugh. Hester stared into the dark surface of her ale, her reflection wavering with each faint ripple. She admitted quietly, almost to herself, that Kathleen's reserved nature had made it difficult for the princess to form true friendships. Even when she did, those bonds had rarely been genuine. Arthur's voice was steady as he reminded her that Kathleen had not been without support. Hester herself had been there, shaping her into the remarkable woman she had become. Arthur added that perhaps Jasmine too had been influenced by her guidance. Hester scoffed at the idea, brushing aside the credit. Kathleen and Jasmine would have grown into great women regardless. Jasmine especially had forged her own path. Then her sharp eyes flicked to Arthur, realizing his familiarity with her family's name went beyond simple knowledge. His parents had been adventurers alongside Jasmine in the Twin Horns. Arthur confirmed it, revealing that Jasmine had once been his guardian during his own time as an adventurer. That truth softened Hester's tone. She acknowledged that if he had traveled with Jasmine, then he must know well the reputation of the Flamesworth line. Arthur replied that he knew enough to recognize not all carried the same prideful arrogance. Hester's expression shifted with memory. Jasmine, she explained, was the daughter of her younger brother, a good child, one she could not fault. Her siblings, too, had never given much cause for complaint, but Jasmine's father had been consumed by pride, perhaps more than any fire mage of his generation. He had long hoped she would become a dual elemental mage, yet when it became clear wind was her only affinity, he had cast her out. Hester's jaw tightened as she admitted her regret that she had not done more for Jasmine, especially after her awakening. She tipped back the mug in one heavy swallow, then slammed it onto the table with force. Her voice was rough as she declared her relief that Jasmine had found good people to lean on, but she warned Arthur sharply not to mistake that as permission to disparage her brother, no matter his failings. Arthur leaned back, calm in the face of her protectiveness. He assured her he had no intention of fighting Jasmine's battles on her behalf. The tension eased as Hester lifted her refilled mug, clinking it against his. She remarked that she was simply making sure he wouldn't go around insulting the Flamesworth name. name. Arthur laughed, teasing her that in that moment she sounded every bit the part of one. Arthur casually asked Hester what her brother was doing now, remarking that most of the Flamesworth family seemed tied to the war effort. Hester answered without hesitation. Trotius, her brother, served as a captain. His division was counted among the main forces stationed at the wall. Before Arthur could respond, a young woman at a nearby table caught the name. She approached, her eyes bright with recognition, and asked if Hester truly was Hester Flamesworth. She said eagerly that her father had once served under Hester's command. Hester's reply was cautious, reminding her that many soldiers had passed through that division, but the woman pressed on, her admiration plain. She had grown up hearing countless stories of Hester's feats in the Battle of Eddiston. The woman begged to hear all about it, joined by her companion, who cheerfully declared he would buy a round for the table. Hester began to decline, insisting she could not, until Arthur interrupted. With a grin, he declared that she was off duty and deserved a drink or two. Leaning closer, he whispered a suggestion, that she let herself relax, that Kathleen was more than capable of handling herself, and that drawing attention away from a lance in the room would do them all good. Hester smirked at the slyness of it, muttering that Virion had been right. Arthur was a brat. Sylvie, perched nearby, added her own quiet observation, calling him sneaky. Arthur feigned innocence, insisting he only wanted his dear mentor to enjoy free drinks for once. What harm could there be in that? Sylvie only warned that karma would find him sooner or later. Arthur was about to protest when a small group of young girls edged closer, their voices timid but full of awe. They asked if he was truly Arthur Leywin, the newest lance. Before he could answer, another voice joined in, smooth and confident. Kathleen had arrived, stepping into the circle with composure. She declared that Arthur was indeed a lance, but off duty for the night. Her eyes flicked between Arthur and Hester, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she teased them for starting the party without her. Arthur remarked that a single drink hardly qualified as a party, though the group of young girls nearby seemed to think otherwise. They whispered among themselves in hushed excitement, recognizing the princess at his side. Their speculation grew bolder, wondering if Arthur and Kathleen were more than comrades, before one rushed off, eager to share the rumor with the rest. Kathleen, unfazed, turned her gaze toward Hester. She admitted it was good to see her enjoying herself, as the loyal guard often worked too hard. Arthur noted that Hester had mentioned serving her family for a long time. Kathleen confirmed this, explaining that while Hester had always been present, she had only been assigned to her personally after the Battle of Xyrus. By then, her trust in Hester and her abilities had already been unshakable. Arthur asked whether her brother Curtis had a guard of his own. Kathleen shook her head as she sipped her drink, saying that was Grotter's role. At the mention of the name, Sylvie perked up, chirping happily that she liked Grotter. Arthur laughed, translating her sentiment aloud, which made Kathleen smile softly. She admitted that she missed him too. Arthur, with a playful grin, teased that she didn't mean Curtis. Kathleen's answer carried both affection and exasperation. Curtis, she explained, had always been protective. Their parents had instilled in him the duty of caring for her, and though he encouraged her to leave the library when she buried herself in study, he was never far away in case she needed him. She believed he would have been the same even without their royal titles. When he had been offered his new role at Lancelor, he had almost turned it down out of hesitation to leave her side. But with the war escalating, she had convinced him his duty was greater. In the end, he had accepted, and his efforts there had already set many students on the path to success. Kathleen admitted she was proud of him, though it had been a little lonely without him by her side. She would never tell him as much, but the next time she saw him, she wanted to show him, wanted to show everyone, how much she had grown. Arthur's expression softened. He told her he was glad she had been assigned as one of his mentors, and Kathleen, equally earnest, admitted she was glad as well. Arthur then added that he hoped they might see Curtis again soon, along with the others from Xyrus. It had been too long. A brief pause lingered before he asked, with a hint of caution, if she had heard from Claire. Kathleen fell silent at Arthur's question. Claire's condition lingered in her memory, and the promise to keep it from him weighed heavily on her. Torn between truth and secrecy, she chose instead to drown the conflict in her chest. With a sudden motion, she lifted her mug and drained it in one gulp, the act startling Arthur as she slammed the empty vessel onto the table. With flushed cheeks and a spark in her eyes, she declared her intention to dance. Before Arthur could react, she seized his hand and pulled him toward the tavern's makeshift dance floor. The lively music filled the air, the rhythm pulsing through the crowd as Kathleen began to move with unrestrained energy. Arthur followed, caught off guard at first but quickly matching her steps. She shouted that she simply wanted to dance, and he gave in with a smile, agreeing to her wish. A sudden misstep made her stumble with an embarrassed gasp, and Arthur chuckled at her expense, teasing her gently by asking if she had been expecting ballroom music. Her blush deepened as she admitted that perhaps such refinement had been an unlikely hope in a place like this. Arthur laughed harder, unable to contain himself, though the warmth in his voice revealed he was enjoying her playful, almost childlike movements. At last, he extended his hand to her with a smile, offering to guide her properly. Kathleen's eyes brightened, glowing with eagerness, and without hesitation she placed her hand in his. Together they moved in sync, their laughter blending with the music as the tavern's noise faded into the background of their shared moment. Far away, in another another corner of the world, Tessia moved through a dense forest with her team. Without warning, a rush of emotion surged within her, boiling into anger. Her fist lashed out instinctively, striking Darvis squarely and sending him reeling with a groan. Confused, he demanded to know what had provoked her. Tessia could only stammer, admitting that she had suddenly felt an inexplicable surge of rage. Thanks for watching, like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching!